Hey guys, welcome back to this belt building series. Thank you for joining me. In episode number 1, we talked about measuring the full length on a belt, how we come up with that measurement for sizing purposes, as well as marking these holes down at the buckle end and how to mark for your end if you don't have a special punch there. I'm really excited for episode number 2, where we're going to go over dye and finish work and talking about getting an even color, especially with those lighter colors that can be a bit tricky. But today, as promised, we're here to go to the tooling marble and do this bonus content on tooling up a pattern using your beginner set tools. Now, if you don't have this pattern already, there's a link down below in the description. But if you're a member of our email community, you should have this pattern already. If not, follow that link in the description, get this pattern, we'll head over to the marble and start tooling. As we get started, there's a couple things that I've done in preparation here. So on the back of our belt blank, I've put a clear packing tape. Just nothing fancy, just clear packing tape. But that's going to help prevent stretching as we're tooling. So we want this belt to stay the same size. The other thing I did once I printed my pattern out is I taped front and back on this. Now that's with the same clear packing tape, and that's going to help protect our pattern because we're going to actually get this wet. So paper on wet leather, not so bueno. But now, just using regular water here and my sponge, we're going to wet this leather down. And this is called casing your leather. Really fancy word that just means getting the moisture content right in that leather. So we can dive deeper into this into further videos, but really I'm watching to see how quick that water's absorbing in there. That's telling me how much moisture is actually in that leather. So I'm getting this wet enough that it's taken just a second for it to absorb in there. And that's what I want. We're getting that moisture down into that belt, not just the surface level of it. Okay, for transferring this pattern, I'm going to be using my stylus. This is just straight out of the beginner's kit, but if you don't have this and you just got a little bit of stuff there, grab a ballpoint pen. Preferably one that's out of ink so you don't risk getting ink on your leather, but even one with ink, you can get by with that as well, and it's going to do a good job transferring this pattern. So down at the end of my belt, you'll notice there's little marks on this pattern. I'm going to run that mark right to the end of where that point comes in at, and we're going to start transferring there. So I'm going to hold this down, going over my lines, simply pushing down and tracing those lines with that leather wet is going to leave us a mark under there, and that's going to be a guideline. Now this border line, I'm not transferring that yet, and I'll show you how I transfer that here in just a second. But I want to make sure that that border line is consistent and even with the edge of that leather. And you'll notice as you're transferring this pattern, it's easy to maybe get off of a line or have one wiggle a little bit on you, and that's okay. These are guidelines. Doesn't have to be completely exact, but if I'm checking to see if I covered my lines at all, if I got all of my lines, all I have to do is keep that pattern held down in one spot, and I can pick it up and then it'll go right back down. The last few lines here, we'll talk about how to make this pattern go for the full length of your belt. If I was moving this pattern along, what you'd want to do is mark on this little mark right here. We'd put a little mark out. Now we simply slide that pattern down, line that mark up, and then continue on, and it would line up just right to tool out the rest of the way. But seeing as how I'm down at the end, I'm stopping here, this line, I'm just going to continue it on and run it up to where it's under that border as well. And we'll just stop it right here. But that border line, how are we going to do that? One way we can do that, the way I like to do it, is with what's called my wing dividers. This tool here I can adjust and make just that into where the edge of my tooling is, and pull that right along there. Now if you don't have a set of these, you can use a compass from the art store, and it is going to work the same way. The other thing you can do is just get your straight edge. So if you had your ruler here, I'm going to use this pattern as my ruler right now, but we can put that in place and then trace right along our edge there. Main thing is that line is parallel to this outside line, and it's a nice consistent straight line. Out here on the end where this is open like this, I'm just gonna put a couple lines in here to finish this off. So just like this pattern's coming out from here, I'm gonna put one line here. We're gonna bring another line right in there. So now we just have a little vine right there. One other thing that's going to be helpful for you guys, the background spots on your pattern should be shaded in, but if you put a little dot on the shaded spots there, that's going to translate into your background spots when we go to tooling this. So I'm just going to go put those dots in here so we can see those. Now it's time to cut our pattern in. So let's get this swivel knife. And talking about how to use this, I always want to be pulling this knife to me. Instead of being flat like that, we got to tip up as we pull back, so we're cutting with that blade, not just running it into the leather. I want to keep it straight up and down and not tipped that way. You're going to have a little bit of that tipping, but if we tip too far, you get an undercut, and that's not good either. So if you need to get to where you can see, move your body, not your hand. Kind of lock my wrist as I pull this. I'm going to go straight down. We're going to pull these border lines first. Now that that border's pulled, let's start at the tip here. We'll kind of work our way back. And we're going to start pulling these lines in. Now when I'm pulling my lines, I'm not connecting those. You can see I'm leaving them off of there just a little bit. The reason being, that's going to help our pattern hold up over time. I don't want to create a point there that can then lift up as this belt's being worn. Now when we come back with another tool, we're going to bevel that in all the way, and it'll look just like it's cut in. And again, I'm pulling these cuts to me. When we go to make these rounded cuts, I can move that leather and my knife so we can get a smooth cut around there. These tighter curves like this, I'm going to start up in the middle of that curve, and I'm going to pull one line down this way. Notice these lines that are ending within the vine work, I'm lightening my pressure and fading those off. Go back up to where that cut started, and we can come around the other side of that rather than trying to fight getting around that entire curve. Again, those lines that end in there, I'm lightening that pressure up. Fade those lines out. The more practice you get, the easier that's going to be. A lot of times when I find that people are having trouble fading their lines out, it's because they're not starting their lines deep enough. So keep that in mind. There's a good chance you probably just need to put more pressure down when you're starting that cut. Remember, the depth of your cut is going to come from this top finger pushing down. We can't be squeezing this tool with these fingers trying to push down with those. We need that. We need those fingers able to rotate so we can get that knife turning as well. If your leather's starting to get dry at all on you, we can re-wet that. That's not a problem. So I'm going to just wet that down a little bit. Now this time it's not going to take near as much water as it did the first time because we do have that base set in there. Now we're going to reach up and look for our large bevel. Now this tool here, this is a checkered bevel, so you can see the texturing on that tool. But we got a nice crisp straight line on the back of that tool there. Now this is the wider one of the two. If you have this beginner's kit, we're going to use the wider one. That one's going to be really good for moving down this line here. All right, using the maul here to hit the top of that tool. We're going to start by beveling this border. Now the goal that we're after is a nice smooth bevel line like this. We don't want choppy lines, we want just a nice smooth shadow in there. I'm always working with the flat face of that bevel towards me so I can see it in my line. Now to slow this down a little bit, what am I doing? I'm hitting that tool down, I let it pick back up out of there, and I move it over just slightly, and I hit it down again. I don't want to move a full tool length over there, so you can see how that starts creating that choppiness in there. We don't want to avoid that. If you get a little bit of choppiness, we can go back and touch that up, lightly smooth that over a bit. But I'm hitting that tool, letting it pick up out of there, and moving it over a little bit. So it can, I want to slow it down and explain that because it can look like I'm just dragging this tool through here. But once you get doing this more, you'll get rhythm figured out and get your timing. What happens when people get choppy lines is they hear this rhythm that I have going and they try to keep that rhythm, so they're hitting this tool a lot and not moving it consistently as they're doing it. They'll either hit it too many times in one spot, or they'll hit it and then finally pull that tool and it'll move inconsistently and you'll get those choppy lines. So as you're starting, slow down, hit it, move, hit it, move, hit it, move. And you'll get that timing figured out. And it's just a coordination thing with your hands, but it can take some getting used to for sure. Now right now as I'm running this tool, I'm running it primarily straight up and down. I'm not tipping forward and back, and I'm not tipping left and right very much. If anything, I have it canted just slightly away from the direction that we're moving, making it easy to walk that bevel up onto the leather as I'm moving it to the side. Now as we look at beveling the lines in the vine work, we want to talk about one way to figure out which side of the line do I bevel, because that can be one of the hardest things to figure out when you're starting. I don't know, it just looks like lines. I don't know where to go at. So we talked about marking those background spots. Let's use that as a reference point. Any line, we're going to bevel towards that background. So we have a background spot right here. I'm going to find a line and I'm going to bevel towards it, meaning that shadow is going in towards the background, pushing that background down away from our vine work. And once you start on one side of a line, we're going to continue on that side, meaning I can finish that line out all the way. Anywhere we faded those cuts, we can fade with our bevel as well by just lightening our pressure as we finish that off. Now that background spot, where's another line that's to it? Right here. So I go towards that. Continue on that same line until I run into something or until that cut fades out. Now we can go through this entire pattern just finding that background spot and beveling towards it. Again, once I started on that line in that direction, I just continue it and follow that all the way around. That's going to be a good rule of thumb. There's a couple other ways we can find which line to go or which way to go on those lines. We talk about pattern layout and flow and things like that that can get a little bit more in depth, but I found this to be the easiest kind of a hack to go at here, is just looking for those background spots and beveling towards those. Again, those are going to be those grayed out spots in your pattern there, and it's going to help you start looking at what you're actually tooling and not seeing it for a line, but starting to see a pattern kind of emerging here. Now this little tight, these rounded ones, that big bevel is hard to fit in. If I try beveling around here, it's going to really kind of get choppy and eat up leather that I don't want to have done. So we can do a couple things. One, if your bevel's too big for a spot, you can tip that bevel to the side, and now I've just shortened up the face of that, and we can get around there. We just have to be careful that we're not gouging in and creating choppy lines. The other way to do that is to size down on bevels. We'll get that smaller bevel here for the inside of those curves, and now that walks around a lot better. So I'm going to work through this pattern. We're going to keep beveling these spaces out. Now, for me, it's easier to bevel all the way down here, looking at all these lines that we can reach from this side of the belt, and then turning that belt at the end, we'll turn it around and come down the other way and bevel all the other lines. If it's easier at first for you to find one background space, turn your belt around and bevel all the lines that are looking at that background space, that's fine too. Whatever's going to make it easiest for you and help you put the pieces together and see what it is you're tooling. Now that our beveling's done, we're going to go to shading. Now what I like using for my shading is what's called a vertical line thumbprint. And you can see on here, there's lines on this running vertically along with this tool. One end's a little bit bigger, another end's a little bit narrower, and that's just going to be for whatever fits best in the place we're using that. Now, so far our tools have all been straight up and down. This one's one we're going to move a bit. We're going to tip that and tilt that and get some shading going here. We'll start down at this end where the end of the pattern is. We'll call these sticker vines, these ones that just branch out off to the side. Now they're tipping out like that, so they're rounded on this side. That's the end we're going to look at here. And I'm going to tip this tool up so that it fades off as it's moving down here. I'm going to walk that kind of like a bevel. And I'm creating a little highlighted ridge right out on the edge of this vine. run that shading up there. And then we tilt that as it's coming down and it fades off, so we don't have a hard line at the end of this, but it just gradually fades out there. So the same thing here on this side. You can see we've created this highlighted ridge right here, and then we're fading that down that vine a little ways. And we want to go easy with it and not go too much shading on there, because the power of this shading is that we have some, and that is different than shading that whole vine, because we're adding depth to this pattern, and if we just mat that all the way down, then it doesn't add to our depth, it really just takes away, it just takes it down to another dimension. So we're gonna catch these sticker vines first. Again, creating that little highlighted ridge on the rounded part of that vine. Just like the bevel, small movements is going to keep that from being choppy. So I'm going to skip these two swirls for now. We'll come back up, catch these. Sticker vines there. I'm keeping the lines from this vertical line thumbprint, so the whole tool itself going down that vine. I don't want to come like this and be across from there, because it's going to take away from your flow rather than add to that. So we're keeping those lines going with the direction that that vine's actually growing. And anywhere that we have something tucked in underneath another one, for example, these tucking under the borders, or this one tucking up under that swirl, I run that shading clear up to that line so it goes down underneath there. All right, just a couple more of these vines, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do on these swirls for shading. Coming back to these swirls, there's two differences here. Two of these, the ones out on towards the end, are just going around, they come back to that tip. Those we're going to leave alone. These next two, you can see they fold around and come underneath themselves, so we're actually looking at the back side of that. That's where we're going to come in and put that shader in here. Again, just helping to add that depth. We'll push that down a little bit. We'll do the same thing on this one that folds over as well. The next tool here, this is called your veiner. It's kind of this little half round tool with some slots in it there. These are going to come in different sizes and shapes, but this is the one just out of the beginner's kit. I'm going to use this on the outside of these swirls, so think about the outside being, this line's coming around here. I'm going to have the curve of that veiner going with the curve of that swirl there. But another tool that I'm going to tip. So we're going to tip this here. I'm going to rotate it up to where the impression is going to be pointing towards the center of that swirl here. Now back where this line fades out, we're going to start just real light. Keeping my spacing consistently. As we get around the corner of this, I'm hitting just a little bit harder. Now we're going to lighten off as it's coming around towards that tip. So it gives a little bit of texture just on the outside of that. This other one that's going that same direction, we're going to do the same thing. Notice we're starting in very light, really tipped, so we're just barely getting an impression. As we get around to the top of that curve, I'm flattening that tool just a little bit more to get more of an impression from my veiner here, and then I'll lighten it back off as we come around to that tip. Turn this around and catch our other 2 swirls that are going the other way. Rotating that tool as we go, keeping the impression pointing back towards the center of that turn back. Next tool we're going to do, this is going to make a big difference. We're going to be coming in with our backgrounder. Now this one is the matte backgrounder, so it's flat across here with some texture to it, and this is going to push down our backgrounds. So in these little background spots, I want to keep this tool even and more straight up and down. I don't want to tip it and put gouges in there. But this is a very forgiving tool for your backgrounds. This one we can overlap a little bit as needed. The main thing is that we're getting the entire backgrounds covered. I want to take the time to get right up next to the vines and down into the corners without going over my vines. And you can really see that pattern starting to stand out now that we get those backgrounds pushed down. The last step in our tooling is probably one of the more frustrating ones for me to learn, but now has become my favorite part of tooling. Now this is the decorative cuts. So we're going to come back with our swivel knife, and we're going to add a little bit of these decorative cuts to help bring this pattern to life, add flow to it. So we have vines that are going out away from there. We're going to come back with what's called decorative cuts and add a little bit of flow right there. So there's no one right way to do these. They're always going to look a little bit different, but a few of the rules that I tend to look at is always having at least 2 or 3 cuts together. I never want to have just one cut. I think it looks better to have at least a couple in there, one a little shorter, one a little longer. I'm staggering those cuts, so one kind of goes short, one goes longer, and there's always some curve to them. I'm starting those cuts deep and fading them off light. That's going to really help the overall look to those as well. So we've gone along here, and everywhere we had a sticker vine coming out, we've added a couple cuts in that. Now for these swirls, what are we going to do here? Let's look at them and work our way up here. This one here is kind of tucked underneath that border, so I want to show you on this one first that we can see a little bit more of it, and then you'll understand better at what we're doing here. But out towards this tip, I'm going to come following us around. I'm staggering like 3 of those cuts on the outside, but they're pulling around the curve back down towards that center. Now if these cuts were to continue, they wouldn't run into each other. They just kind of all fade together here. Now bring a longer one on the inside. Again, there's different ways you can do these cuts. That just happens to be one way that I like on here. Pull a few short ones and a longer one around there as well. So now instead of starting right up here at the tip, I'm going to act like they've come from out from underneath that border. On This one, we have a little bit more room, so we can get them going around there and then pull that main cut in there. Thanks for tooling along with me today in this video. Let me know what tool you think that you're going to be able to run better after watching this. Also, be on the lookout for the next video, which is going to be our official number 2 in this series, and we're going to talk about dye and finish work, some of the different products to use and how to use those. We'll look forward to seeing you there.